For 30 years, Sarah lived in silence, paralyzed from the waist down, while her dad, George, gave up everything to care for her. But lately, something's changed. Subtle signs. Barely noticeable movements. And now, a secret George never saw coming is about to come to light. What would you do if everything you thought you knew about the person you love was suddenly turned upside down? George woke to the familiar sound of the alarm clock. The room was dark, the heavy curtains blocking any hint of the morning breaking outside. He got out of bed, feeling his bones protest with each movement, a reminder that time was relentless. The routine was always the same: get dressed, tidy up the kitchen, prepare breakfast. But what weighed heaviest was the stillness of the house, the silence echoing between the worn walls. Sarah was already awake. She always was. Sitting in her wheelchair, she stared out of the window, her eyes fixed on something beyond the view. George approached with a breakfast tray and placed it on the small table in front of her. "Here you go," he said, not really expecting a response. Sarah didn't speak, just nodded slightly. The sound of the plate scraping across the table was their only communication. George adjusted Sarah's chair, making sure she was comfortable. It was a motion he did almost automatically, as if it were an extension of his body, a gesture repeated so many times over the years that it had become part of him. Time seemed to have stopped in that house. Since the accident that took away Sarah's mobility and claimed his wife, the weight of the past had always been present, silent, yet constant. George lived among the ghosts of what had been and what would never be. He looked at his daughter once more before stepping out the door. His fingers trembled slightly over the tray, but he quickly averted his gaze. Perhaps it was just his imagination. Outside, the biting wind greeted him. George closed the door, trying to drown out the uncomfortable feeling that always accompanied him when he left the house, leaving Sarah alone. The day unfolded with an unsettling calmness. As George walked to work, his thoughts wandered like dry leaves blown by the wind. The school routine was a refuge, but even there, the restlessness followed him. The conversation with Henry, the elderly neighbor, still echoed in his mind. What did he mean by those strange sounds? What could be happening inside his house while he was away, preoccupied with the day's obligations? Henry had always been an observant man, a silent witness to the lives around him. That morning, as George passed through the gate, the old man stopped him with a gesture. "George," he called, his voice trembling like the leaves in a breeze. "Have you noticed anything different about your house?" George hesitated. It was just a neighbor being concerned, but the question rang in his mind like an alarm bell. He shook his head, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. "Nothing much, Henry. Just the usual routine," he replied, avoiding eye contact. The old man frowned but didn't press further. George walked away, the worry growing inside him like a shadow stretching along the path. Upon arriving at school, interactions with colleagues and students became a blur. He found himself thinking of Sarah, her distant gaze as if there was something unspoken between them. Later, as he returned home, George felt a chill run down his spine. The door was ajar, and a sense of unease enveloped him. Stepping inside, everything seemed in order. The smell of coffee he had left from the previous morning still lingered in the air, but there was something that felt off. He found Sarah in the same position, looking out of the window. But there was a change in her expression, something George couldn't quite identify. Her eyes seemed more alert, almost watchful. He approached her. "How was your day, love?" he asked, trying to break the silence that seemed to intensify between them. Sarah turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting George's. In a gesture that was as rare as it was unsettling, she pressed her lips together, but no words came out. The communication between them, always marked by the absence of speech, now felt heavy with meaning. George sat on the edge of the bed, his mind brimming with questions. There was something more happening here, something he wasn't willing to acknowledge. He felt the urge to ask about what Henry had mentioned, but the voice in his head held him back. The fear of breaking that delicate balance between them paralyzed him. That night, as the house sank into a deep silence, George found it hard to sleep. The night sounds of the house seemed louder, a creak, a whisper, something that brought back memories of his conversation with Henry. He got up, moving cautiously, as if each step could reveal a dark secret. Echoes of a life that wasn't what he had imagined filled the air. What was really going on in Sarah's mind? As doubt began to settle in, a subtle restlessness danced around him, wrapping the house in a cloak of mystery. Days dragged on, and each morning felt like an echo of the last, a repetition of automatic movements that George performed almost without thinking. Yet, the restlessness began to turn into an unbearable weight. When he returned from school, he would sit in the chair next to Sarah, trying to focus on the small conversations they still shared. But his mind was far away, trapped in a maze of doubts and fears that wouldn't let him be. At school, he tried to keep himself busy, but the faces of students and the sounds of the classroom became blurs, shadows of a world that felt distant. What was going on in his house? Why did Sarah seem different? Each time he looked at her, he noticed details that had previously gone unnoticed, the lightness in her eyes, an involuntary movement of her fingers that he had ignored, an expression that spoke louder than words. Those moments accumulated like a mosaic of evidence demanding to be acknowledged, but George struggled with the idea that his daughter might be hiding something from him. Flashbacks haunted him. He remembered Sarah's childhood, the joy in her eyes when she learned to ride a bike before the accident. Her laughter had filled the house, a melody of happiness. Now, everything was cloaked in silence. The weight of responsibility crushed his shoulders. What if he was fooling himself? What if Sarah, in her condition, was struggling to communicate with him in a way he couldn't understand? Night fell, and George found himself once again watching the recordings he had made with the cameras installed in the house. He had made that decision in a moment of desperation, driven by the fear that his reality was an illusion. With each new recording, a fresh wave of emotions washed over him. In the videos, Sarah appeared calm, but there were moments when he noticed small movements, subtle gestures that unsettled him. Doubt morphed into deep concern. What was going on in her mind? George spent the night awake, reliving the moments when he had spotted those signs of life in Sarah. He remembered a day, years ago, when she had smiled at him unexpectedly. That smile had been a light amid the darkness that surrounded them. It was as if, for a brief moment, he saw the daughter he had always known, before everything had changed. But now, the images of their past together were overshadowed by a new kind of fear. What would he do if Sarah was moving, if she had regained some control over her body but couldn't or wouldn't share that with him? He felt torn between the need to protect his daughter and the desperate desire to understand. The next morning, as he prepared for work, George cast a meaningful glance at Sarah. She was quiet, watching the movement of the leaves outside, but her expression conveyed a restlessness that troubled him. George took a deep breath, battling the internal storm that consumed him. What would he do if the truth was more complicated than he could bear? He bid Sarah farewell with his usual murmur, but the weight of that goodbye felt different. As he closed the door, George sensed he was leaving behind not just the house but a part of himself as well. Doubt and fear intertwined like shadows, hovering over the home that should have been a sanctuary but now felt like a labyrinth of unspoken secrets. Tension hung in the air like a storm ready to break. George had become a divided man. On one side, the devoted father who had spent years caring for his daughter; on the other, a man consumed by unanswered questions. That day, what should have been a simple search for a lost object transformed into a crucial turning point in their relationship. Upon entering the house, the familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee enveloped George, but the feeling of comfort quickly faded. His gaze fixed on the shelf where his wife's pocket watch used to rest, now just an empty space that seemed to scream for attention. That item was more than just an object. It was a symbol of family history, memories entwined like the hands of a clock. "Sarah?" His voice echoed in the silence of the house, laden with an urgency he couldn't contain. The sight of Sarah, sitting in the living room, seemed almost ghostly. Her face was turned towards the window, her eyes fixed on the distance, as if she were watching a world he couldn't see. A wave of concern washed over George, a premonition that something was profoundly wrong. "Have you seen your mother's watch?" he asked, his voice betraying a mix of worry and a desperate desire for connection. Sarah turned her head slowly, her clear eyes meeting George's. For a moment, everything fell silent. He could almost hear his racing heart pulsing in his ears. "I don't know," came her soft response, but the words left an icy sensation in his stomach. The way she spoke, with an almost supernatural calmness, unsettled him. It was as if the truth was lurking, hidden beneath the surface of a mundane conversation. George hesitated, sensing that the questions bubbling in his mind could be dangerous. "It was here," George insisted, gesturing to the empty shelf. The watch held emotional weight, a link to a past that couldn't be forgotten. "Didn't you hear anything?" In that instant, Sarah's expression shifted. George noticed a lightness in her gaze, a nuance that made him question everything he knew. There was something there he couldn't ignore. The silence transformed into an invisible battle between father and daughter. That night, as the sun set, George sat on his bed, his mind swirling with images of the life they had built together. What did the absence of that watch mean? The question lodged in his heart like an unbearable weight. He thought of the memories surrounding that object, the laughter, the silent conversations, the unspoken promises. Doubt began to grow, turning into a monster that consumed him. And as the ticking of the watch echoed in his mind, he questioned, was Sarah hiding something from him? Did she have a secret that could change everything? The following morning brought with it a new sun, but the weight of uncertainty continued to press down on his heart. He looked again at Sarah, who remained in her corner, distant. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow on her skin. There was something in her expression, something that evoked a lost connection. George knew he could no longer ignore it. And so, with a tightness in his chest and renewed determination, George knew it was time to act. The missing watch wasn't just an object, it was the key to unlocking a far bigger mystery, a secret that might finally give voice to everything that had remained unsaid for too long. As he left the house, his eyes lingered on the garden, where the flowers had just begun to bloom, a metaphor for the hope he was striving to find. He was about to embark on a journey that would change everything. The question that echoed in his mind was, what was he really about to uncover? The day dragged on slowly, but George's unease only grew. Working as a caretaker at the local school, he could barely focus on his usual tasks. The conversation with Sarah, her expressions, and the mystery of the missing watch nagged at him like an unbearable echo. Every tick of the classroom clock seemed to be a constant reminder of what was missing in his life, not just the object, but the bond between father and daughter that felt like it was unraveling under the weight of doubt. After a tiring day, George returned home with a steely resolve to find out what was really going on. He knew he had to investigate, but how? The idea of setting up cameras to watch Sarah made him uncomfortable, yet the need to understand was stronger. As soon as he got home, his mind was made up. He went to the computer and began looking up discrete cameras he could install around the house. The feeling of invading his daughter's privacy weighed heavy on his conscience, but the fear of the unknown was driving him. That night, while Sarah settled into bed, George quietly set up the cameras, trying to be as discreet as possible. He knew he was crossing a line, but the urgency to uncover the truth consumed him. Once everything was in place, he sat down in front of the computer, anxious to see the recordings. Hours passed, and the darkness of the house became a blanket of anticipation. When the first images appeared, George's heart raced. At first, everything seemed normal. Sarah was lying there, still, the soft night light illuminating her face. But as the minutes ticked by, small movements began to appear. A hand shifting slightly, a finger stretching, things George hesitated to believe for a moment. With each new movement, his mind wrestled between doubt and hope. Could Sarah really be moving? Or was he just seeing what he wanted to see? The images were subtle, but the anxiety swelling inside him was anything but. Why hadn't she said anything? What was she hiding? The recordings revealed a side of Sarah George never knew existed. Despite the paralysis, she seemed to be struggling against the invisible chains holding her back. He wondered if she really wanted to break free or if she was trapped in the fear of disappointing him. The idea that his daughter could be moving, even just a little, brought a light to the years of darkness they'd lived through together. Desperate for answers, George couldn't hold back the urge to confront her. The next morning, his heart was heavy with the tension that had built up over time. The images still replayed in his mind, each more unsettling than the last. He took a deep breath, knowing that the moment of truth had arrived. As he entered Sarah's room, there she was again, in the same position, gazing out of the window. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow across the room, a stark contrast to the weight of the situation. "Sarah, we need to talk," he started, his voice firm but laced with anxiety. "I've seen the recordings." Her expression shifted. A mix of surprise and apprehension crossed her face. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her eyes reflecting a blend of vulnerability and resistance. "I saw you moving last night." "That's not what you've been telling me." "Why didn't you say anything?" The question came out heavy, slicing through the air between them. Sarah hesitated, her hands trembling slightly on the bed covers. The tension was palpable, as if the room was filled with unsaid words. George could sense her inner struggle. He wanted to understand, but feared what her answer might reveal. I didn't want to let you down," Sarah finally confessed, her voice soft and shaky. "Every time I tried, you always seemed so hopeful. What if I failed again?" The revelation hung between them, a moment of clarity that began to unravel the darkness that had settled over them. George could finally see the battle his daughter had been fighting, one he had overlooked for so long. The weight of expectations lifted, allowing him to breathe again. "You could never let me down, Sarah. The only thing I want is for you to feel free to be who you are," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. In that moment, something shifted. The shadows that had clouded their relationship began to fade. Sarah's internal struggle was deeper than George had realized, and by acknowledging it, he felt closer to her than ever before. The mystery wasn't just about what she had hidden, but what they could build together from here. As their words flowed, a new understanding began to emerge, lighting the path they still had to walk together. The tension still hung in the air like a dense fog that refused to lift. George barely slept that night, his thoughts swirling like leaves caught in the wind. Sarah's confession echoed in his mind, and the idea that she could feel her limbs made him question everything he thought he knew about her condition. At the same time, a new feeling crept in, a glimmer of hope he didn't dare fully explore yet. The next morning, as George got ready for work, there was a soft knock at the door. It was Henry, the elderly neighbor who often stopped by for a chat. His face was lined with concern, and George immediately felt a knot form in his stomach. "Morning, George. Sorry to bother you," Henry began, leaning slightly forward, as if the news he carried was weighing him down. "I've found something you might want to see." George frowned, his senses on high alert. The old neighbor held out his hand, revealing Sarah's mother's pocket watch, glinting in the morning sun. The once pristine object was now caked with dirt, a silent witness to unresolved mysteries. "Where did you find this?" George asked, his voice tighter than he intended. "It was in the garden, underneath your daughter's bedroom window," Henry replied, watching George's reaction carefully. "Thought you ought to know." George took the watch, his heart pounding. This only deepened the questions he had about Sarah. He looked at the neighbor, his thoughts racing. Was Sarah trying to send him a message? What else could she be hiding? "Thanks, Henry. This is important," George said, forcing a smile that barely concealed his unease. "Just be careful, George. Things aren't always what they seem. Life can get complicated," Henry said with a serious tone before walking away. George stepped back inside, his mind spinning. He headed for Sarah's room, the watch heavy in his hand like an anchor. She was there, sitting on her bed, her eyes fixed on the window, as if waiting for something. "Sarah, we need to talk," he began, his voice shaky but determined. She turned her head slowly, and George could see the unease in her eyes. "It's about the watch," he said, holding it tightly. "It was found in the garden." "How did that happen?" Sarah glanced at the watch, her face a storm of emotions. "I don't know, Dad. I swear I don't. I didn't do anything," she blurted, her voice tinged with fear and confusion. George stepped closer, feeling the need to connect. He didn't want to be the accusing father, but doubt was gnawing away at his trust. "Sarah, something's going on here that I don't understand. You're moving, and you're keeping things from me. I just want the truth," he said, his words weighted with a tension they both felt. The air between them thickened, an emotional battlefield where love and mistrust tangled together. Sarah, though, looked more vulnerable than ever. "I just wanted you to be proud of me. Since the accident, I've felt like I've let you down," she whispered, tears beginning to glisten in her eyes. George's heart tightened. In his search for answers, he had forgotten the pain Sarah carried. The expectations he had placed on her had become chains, holding her back. "It's not about letting me down, Sarah. It's about us being honest with each other. We need to face this together. If you've been moving, if there's something you haven't told me, now's the time," George said, his voice softening, letting his love for her show. At that moment, Sarah's expression shifted. There was fragility, but also a flicker of determination. "I do feel things sometimes, Dad. When I'm calm, I can feel a lightness in my feet. But I was scared you wouldn't understand, or that you'd expect too much," she confessed, each word falling out like a burden she'd been carrying for years. George felt frozen. This was the confession he had always hoped for, yet the reality was more complicated than he had imagined. The walls they had built between them over the years were beginning to crumble, but the moment's fragility brought with it a new kind of tension. "Then we'll face it together. No matter how long it takes, I'll be by your side," George said, his determination unwavering, refusing to let fear win. Sarah smiled, a smile that lit up her face but was still laced with uncertainty. "And what if I can't do it?" she asked, her voice heavy with doubt. "It's not about whether you can or not. It's about the fact that we're in this together. We'll figure it out, won't we?" he replied, reaching out to gently touch her arm. In that moment, a new understanding blossomed. The watch still rested in George's hand, but now it symbolized more than just a mystery to be solved. It became a symbol of hope and rebuilding. They had a long road ahead, but together, they would rediscover what it meant to truly live, not just exist, but live. Sarah's eyes were a mix of hope and doubt, but there was also a new spark of determination. They were ready to face the next chapter, and as the day unfolded, the feeling that something was about to change hung in the air. With Sarah's confession, a new dynamic took root between father and daughter, though tension still lingered. George felt the weight of responsibility, and Sarah's internal struggle to accept her condition was becoming more and more evident. He was committed to supporting her, yet there were moments when his own insecurity and doubt crept in, casting shadows over the light that had begun to shine between them. The days that followed were marked by a mix of hope and frustration. George threw himself into researching alternative treatments, therapies that might help Sarah reconnect with her body and conquer her fears. He often found himself reliving the agony of all those years spent in the grip of uncertainty and fear of failure. Every small step she took was a victory, but also a reminder of how far they had come in their fight. On the other hand, Sarah was wrestling with her own internal battle. The moments when she felt lightness in her limbs brought her joy, but the fear of failing kept her trapped in doubt. There were days when she felt motivated to try moving, but others where uncertainty paralyzed her once again, leaving her caught in a cycle of self-doubt. One day, while George was at work, Sarah decided it was time to face her limitations. With the camera still set up, she positioned herself on the bed and began to focus. Her heart raced as she attempted to move her toes, adrenaline rushing through her veins. There was no one else around, and the room was wrapped in a tense silence. When George returned home, however, a fresh wave of insecurity washed over him. He looked at Sarah, now sitting on the edge of the bed, looking more determined than ever. "What happened?" he asked, his concern clear in his voice. "I'm trying, Dad. I really am," Sarah replied, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and frustration. "But it's so hard. Sometimes I feel like I'm moving, and other times, it's like I can't." The tension between them grew, a blend of love and fear. George wanted to encourage her, but the fear of what could happen if she failed left him anxious. "What if you hurt yourself?" he began, but stopped mid-sentence, realizing his words could discourage her. "And what if I succeed? What if this means I can truly live again?" she challenged him, her determination unwavering. The force of her question froze George. She was right, what they were risking was Sarah's potential to reclaim her life, to push past the limits that had been imposed on her. "I don't want you to get hurt, but you need to know I'm here for you," George said, his voice calmer. "We'll face this together." And with that, like a beam of light breaking through the clouds, a new understanding blossomed between them. Sarah was ready to try, and George decided he wouldn't let fear control them. He saw the reflection of his daughter's unbreakable spirit and knew it was time for them to take this next step together, no matter how hard it might be. Days turned into weeks, and their journey had only just begun. But the bond they were forging, a connection built on truth and acceptance, was stronger than any challenge they could face. They were determined to rediscover life, and more importantly, rediscover each other. With each passing day, George realized that what truly mattered wasn't just Sarah's physical recovery, but the emotional reconnect guiding them forward. And with that, they were ready to face whatever the future held. The room was filled with a heavy silence, broken only by Sarah's labored breathing. The days of training had led her to this crucial moment, where she decided to challenge not just her physical limits, but her emotional ones as well. George stood a few steps away, his gaze filled with a mixture of concern and hope. He knew this was a turning point, but the uncertainty made him hesitate. Sarah was determined to stand up from the bed. The thought of moving in ways she hadn't since the accident sent a surge of adrenaline through her. She took a deep breath, focusing on each part of her body, willing herself to ignore the pain and frustration that came with it. "I can do this, Dad. I know I can," she said, her voice heavy with resolve. George watched as she prepared for the battle raging inside her. He wanted to shout words of encouragement, but he was stuck in a tangle of emotions. He knew that it wasn't just Sarah's ability to move at stake, but the inner struggle she was facing to believe in herself. Sarah closed her eyes, letting memories of her childhood and the laughter she'd shared with her dad wash over her. She recalled all the times she'd overcome challenges. If her mum were here, she'd say, "Believe in yourself, love." That memory was the fuel Sarah needed. With a newfound determination, she began to move slowly, her muscles contracting with such effort it felt like she was dragging a car uphill. The movement was weak, barely noticeable, but it was movement. What had once seemed impossible was now happening right before George's eyes. "That's it, Sarah. Keep going," he exclaimed, his voice thick with emotion. With every inch she moved, George's hope grew. But when Sarah tried to push herself all the way up, a wave of pain hit her. She lost her balance and fell back onto the bed, a cry of frustration escaping her lips. George rushed to her, concern etched across his face. "Sarah, it's okay. You tried. That's already a win," he said, trying to soothe her, but her expression said otherwise. "No. I have to do this," Sarah shouted, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm so tired of feeling trapped." The intensity of her emotional pain matched her desire to be free. Anger, sadness, and frustration all swirled together, forming a storm that blinded her to the fact she'd already made a big step forward. George, realizing just how deep her internal struggle went, started to reflect on his own life. He remembered times when he'd faced his own demons, the insecurities that had haunted him. It was time to turn this moment into a turning point. "Sarah, I get what you're feeling. Just remember, the journey isn't about reaching the end quickly, it's about every little step you take. You're stronger than you think, much stronger." His voice was now full of warmth and encouragement. And with those words, something shifted. Sarah lifted her eyes, and instead of seeing the floor beneath her, she saw the journey that had brought her here. With each beat of her heart, she began to find her center again. "I want to try again," she said, the determination beginning to shine in her eyes. George smiled, the hope rekindled between them. "That's it. We'll do it together. I'm right here," he said, reaching out his hand to her. And so, they braced themselves for the most intense battle they'd ever faced together. With George's support by her side, Sarah took a deep breath and focused. This time, instead of just trying to stand, he thought of each part of her body as a team. The desire to move became a kind of dance, where each motion brought her one step closer to freedom. The room seemed to hum with their energy. Sarah pushed herself, tears rolling down her cheeks as she fought through the pain. But this time, every movement felt like a celebration. She was feeling life coursing through her again. And finally, with one last push, she managed to stand. George held his breath, his heart in his throat, as his daughter, eyes gleaming with determination, finally stood on her feet. It was a moment of pure emotion. Triumph, struggle, pain, and joy all intertwined in a single instant, creating a memory that would last a lifetime. She was standing, even if only for a brief moment, and in that split second, they both knew that all the suffering, all the struggle, and all the uncertainty had been worth it. As Sarah trembled, but held firm, George realized that what mattered most wasn't just her ability to move, but the strength she had found within herself to face her fears. With tears in his eyes and a smile on his face, he shouted, "You did it, Sarah! You've done it!" The atmosphere in the room shifted, and a sense of triumph wrapped around them. It wasn't just a battle won, but the beginning of a new outlook on life unfolding before them. The journey was far from over, but they were ready to face whatever came next. The days that followed the big breakthrough were marked by a different kind of intensity. George and Sarah, now united by a deeper understanding, began to explore a new routine. Mornings became a ritual, where the first ray of sunlight illuminated the room, bringing a fresh sense of hope. They gathered in the kitchen, where George made breakfast, and the table was always filled with small victories. Each morning, George helped Sarah with simple exercises, encouraging her to move little by little. Every effort she made, no matter how small, was celebrated like a monumental achievement. Laughter replaced the silence, and the house felt more alive, buzzing with a new kind of energy. "Shall we try something new today?" George asked, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. Sarah nodded, a shy smile spreading across her face. "Yes, Dad. I want to try standing up from the chair on my own." With an encouraging glance, George positioned her wheelchair and helped her get ready for the challenge ahead. The anxiety was still there, but alongside it was a newfound confidence. George's heart pounded with every one of her movements, and he was determined to be there with her every step of the way. "Remember, you're stronger than you think," he said, holding her hand as she focused. Sarah took a deep breath, mentally preparing herself. Slowly, she began to rise, using every bit of strength she could muster. The movement was painful, but she felt a wave of determination surge through her body. George watched, pride etched on his face as she fought against gravity and her own limitations. And, after much effort, she did it. She was standing, even if just for a moment, but that was a victory in itself. George couldn't contain his emotion and clapped enthusiastically. "You did it, Sarah! I'm so proud of you!" Sarah looked around, feeling the adrenaline and joy of the moment. She was truly moving again. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of happiness. "Dad, I'm so happy," she exclaimed, her emotions overflowing. From that day on, the exercises became a regular part of their lives. George sought out resources, researched therapies, and even joined support groups where he met other families facing similar challenges. His commitment to caring for Sarah grew into a broader mission, not just to help his daughter, but to heal the emotional wounds he had carried with him. Their new routine was filled with challenges, but also with moments of celebration. One afternoon, while George and Sarah were in the garden, he brought out a small radio and played her favorite song. Although Sarah was still dependent on her wheelchair, she began to move her arms to the rhythm of the music. The joy radiating from her was contagious. George couldn't resist and began to dance around her, laughing and joking. "You're making me look like a professional dancer," he teased, his heart feeling light. "You're the best dancer I know," Sarah replied, laughing as she shook her head. The music had become a soundtrack to their recovery, a form of expression that brought father and daughter even closer together. They danced, laughed, and shared dreams that had been hidden for so long. Sarah opened up about her desire to explore new horizons, to travel and see the world, and George couldn't help but smile as he pictured all the adventures they could share. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah began to show more signs of progress. She felt stronger, more confident. The emotional pain that had once consumed her started to fade, replaced by a sense of achievement and hope. Every movement she made brought her to a new level of self-belief. And with each new milestone, George was there as her rock, celebrating every victory alongside her. One evening, as they sat on the sofa after a long day of exercises, Sarah looked at her dad and said, "Thank you, Dad, for not giving up on me, for believing in me." George felt a lump in his throat, overcome with emotion. He looked into her eyes and saw not just his daughter, but a strong, resilient woman ready to face the world. "You've always had that strength inside you, Sarah. I was just waiting for you to find it," he replied, his voice thick with feeling. His words were full of truth, and the bond between them grew even deeper. They both knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but together, they were ready to face any challenge. Their story was one of resilience and love, and that made them unstoppable. In the end, George and Sarah had rediscovered not just physical movement, but a new sense of life and togetherness. The house that had once been heavy with silence was now a home filled with laughter, music, and hope. They were on this journey of self-discovery and overcoming together, ready to face whatever the future held, side by side, with the knowledge that love and mutual support would always be the keys to true freedom. Sometimes the hardest truth to see is the one that's right in front of us. Sarah and George learned that despite all the struggles, love and courage can guide us through life's deepest mysteries. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Together, we will share more stories that move, inspire, and make us think. If you liked this one, click on the video above. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.